You never forget the smell of aviation fuel in a jungle war. It seeps into your clothes, your skin, your memory. Even after 80 years, I can still close my eyes and smell the mix of hot oil, damp earth, and burned metal from WW2 Airfield, New Guinea, 1943. My name's James McKenna. Back then, I was 27, a technical sergeant with the 5th Air Force, working on P-38 Lightnings. I wasn't a hero, just a man with dirty hands trying to keep others alive. Every morning before sunrise, I'd walk through rows of aircraft glistening with dew and oil, listening to the jungle wake up. The parrots screamed, the generators coughed, and the heat came on fast. By the time the first engine started, sweat was already running down my back. My job was simple: check the engines, tighten bolts, make sure the planes could fly. But nothing about that war was simple. The young pilots who climbed into those cockpits were barely old enough to shave. They'd laugh and talk about home, but I could see the fear in their eyes when the orders came to start up. Some came back shot full of holes, some didn't come back at all. Every evening I'd have to log which planes returned and which didn't. You never forget writing a man's name for the last time. The army said we were winning, but on that flight line it never felt that way. We were losing men faster than we could patch the holes in their aircraft. The Zeros owned the sky back then. They could turn inside our Lightnings like hawks circling heavy prey, and every time one of our boys went up I wondered if I'd ever see him again. The war manuals said to trust the machine, but I didn't. I trusted what I could feel with my own hands, the tension in a cable, the sound of a loose fitting, the faint vibration that told you something was wrong. I was no engineer, but I knew when a plane was lying to me. That summer, under the wet green canopy of New Guinea, I learned that saving a man's life sometimes meant breaking every rule in the book. That summer, one small piece of wire would change everything. The P-38 Lightning was a strange-looking bird. Twin engines, twin booms, a cockpit hanging in between like the heart of a machine split in two. She was fast, powerful, a monster in a climb. At full throttle she could outrun anything the Japanese had, and her firepower could tear a Zero apart in one burst. But speed wasn't everything. The men in the cockpits learned that the hard way. The Lightning was heavy, stiff in her turns, and when you tried to fight a Zero in a flat circle you were already dead. The Japanese Zero was a different kind of creature, light, graceful, almost alive in the air. It could roll and twist in half the space our fighters needed. Watching one was like watching a dancer in the sky, and compared to it, our planes lumbered like trucks on wings. Every pilot knew the rule: never turn with a Zero. That line was printed in every manual, repeated in every briefing. Dive in, fire, climb out, hit and run, never chase. On paper, it made sense. In the air, it got men killed. I remember standing on the edge of the runway, watching another Lightning come home with holes in both booms, and thinking how useless those rules were to the boys trying to stay alive. They were written by men sitting behind desks thousands of miles away, men who'd never felt what it was like to yank a control stick and feel the plane hesitate, while a Zero cut across your tail. Out here, the manuals didn't bleed. The pilots did. Some of those kids would come to me after a mission, shaking, asking why their plane didn't respond fast enough. I'd tell them the same thing I told myself. It's the design, not you. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. The Lightning could be better if someone was willing to take a risk. I'd worked on engines long enough to know that every machine has a heartbeat, and if you listen close enough, it tells you where it's hurting. The trouble was, the higher-ups weren't listening. They trusted the specifications. Me? I trusted the sound of metal and the sweat on my palms. You never forget the faces of the ones who didn't come back. There was Lieutenant David Chen from Sacramento. Quiet kid, always cleaned his own guns before a mission, even though that wasn't his job. He said it helped him think. The last morning I saw him, he joked that he'd send me a postcard from Tokyo. 2 hours later, his wingman came back alone. They said Chen tried to roll out of a fight, and the plane just didn't respond in time. He barely made it home that day, holes in the boom, white as chalk. I patched up his Lightning myself, still smelling the burnt paint around the bullet holes. 3 weeks later, he was gone for good. Shot down over Rabaul in another P-38. Then there was Captain William Morrison, Texas-born, a leader, 11 kills to his name. He used to hum country songs when he checked his flight maps. Said it calmed his nerves. On August 3rd, he took 8 of our boys up to intercept a Japanese patrol. We heard him on the radio, cool, confident, same as always, until his voice cracked. "Controls feel mushy." That was the last thing he ever said. His wingman told me it looked like the lightning just refused to roll fast enough. They found pieces of his plane scattered over the jungle. No pilot error could explain that. And then there was Parker. Thomas Parker from Boston, just 21. He and Hayes had trained together, always teasing each other about who'd get their first kill. On August 14th, Parker's voice came over the radio in panic. "She's not turning fast enough." I can still hear it like it's happening right now. The crackle, the scream, then silence. His bed stayed empty after that. His effects packed in a wooden crate, sent home to a mother who'd never know what really happened. The reports all said the same thing: pilot error, failure to maneuver. But I knew better. I'd checked those planes myself, tuned every engine, tested every cable. They were within spec, sure, but the specs were killing them. Each time I signed off another maintenance log, I felt like I was signing a death warrant. 17 planes by mid-August. 17 signatures that never came home. You tell yourself you're just doing your duty, but duty doesn't stop the ghosts from visiting. It took me months to figure out what was really killing our boys, and it wasn't courage, training, or luck. It was slack. The P-38's aileron control cables ran the full length of those twin booms, weaving through pulleys before reaching the wings. On paper, they were perfect. In reality, they had about 3/8 of an inch of play. Doesn't sound like much, but in a dogfight, that fraction of a second before the ailerons bit the air was long enough to get a man killed. You could feel it if you knew what to look for. I used to run my fingers along those cables after hours, listening to the tone they made when plucked, like strings on a tired guitar. The tight ones sang sharp, the loose ones gave a dull, heavy note, and every lightning I touched sounded just a little flat. One morning I mentioned it to our engineering officer, a clean-handed lieutenant fresh from the States. He barely looked up from his clipboard. "Cable tension's within specs, Sergeant," he said. "Leave it be." I told him specs didn't mean safe. He told me specs were the law. That's how it went. The Army loved its numbers, but those numbers didn't bleed when the plane rolled too slow. I remember standing there in the hangar after he walked away, staring at that gleaming aircraft and thinking how crazy it was that a few thousandths of slack could mean the difference between life and death. To him, it was data. To me, it was 17 empty bunks. I wanted to fix it right then, but regulations wrapped around me like barbed wire. We weren't allowed to alter control systems without authorization from Lockheed, 7,000 miles away in California. Out here, in the mud and humidity, that might as well have been another planet. Still, I couldn't unhear that flat note. Once you knew it was there, it stuck in your head like a bad song. Every time I watched a lightning taxi out, I heard it again, the dull tone of slackened fate humming beneath the roar of those twin engines. It was late, long after the engines had gone silent and most of the men were asleep. The hangar lights buzzed faintly, throwing long shadows over the concrete floor. I was cleaning oil from my hands when I heard footsteps. Lieutenant Robert Hayes stepped out of the dark, his flight suit still damp with sweat and rain. He was just 23, blue eyes, farm kid from Iowa, 6 missions, 0 kills, and the look of a man already half gone. He'd lost his closest friend, Parker, 3 days earlier. You could still see it in his face, the kind of hollow that doesn't come from fatigue but from knowing how close death flies. He didn't salute, didn't bother with formality. He just stood there, staring at the lightning I'd been working on, and asked in a shaky voice, "Is there anything you can do to make her roll faster?" The words hung in the air like smoke. I could hear the desperation under them. He wasn't asking for better performance. He was asking for a chance to live. I wiped my hands on a rag and looked at him. In that moment, I didn't see a lieutenant. I saw my own son if I'd had one. Young, scared, trying not to show it. The kind of kid you want to protect even when you can't. I wanted to tell him no, that it wasn't my place, that the regulations were ironclad. But those rules had buried enough pilots already. Hayes kept his eyes on the airplane, like he was afraid if he looked away it might disappear before dawn. "I don't care if it's against the book," he said quietly. "I just want a chance." His voice cracked on that last word. I nodded slowly. "Come back in the morning," I told him. He hesitated, studying my face as if trying to read whether I meant it. Then he gave a faint nod and walked away into the rain. I stood there a long time after he left, listening to the drip of water on metal, the silence of the sleeping base. I knew what I was about to do would break every rule I'd ever followed, but that night, the rules didn't matter anymore. The hangar was half asleep that night, the air thick with heat and the whine of insects pressing against the lights. Most of the crew was snoring in their bunks, but I stayed behind, alone with Hayes's P-38. The metal skin still held the day's warmth. When I laid my hand on the left boom, it felt like the body of some tired animal waiting for one more fight. I pulled the inspection panel off, flashlight clenched between my teeth. Sweat running down my neck. Inside, the control cables gleamed faintly like stretched veins. I reached in and tugged. There it was again. That damn slack. 3/8 of an inch of play between life and death. I knew what I was about to do could end my career, maybe worse, but doing nothing would end Hayes. I took a 6-inch piece of piano wire from my toolbox, salvaged from a wrecked Lightning weeks ago, and bent it slowly into a Z-shape with my pliers. The wire fought me. It was tough, spring-hard steel meant to hold its shape. My hand slipped twice, and the second time the edge bit into my thumb. Blood mixed with sweat dripping onto the hangar floor. I didn't stop. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it over the buzzing lights. I kept thinking, if this fails, Hayes will die and I'll wear his death forever. When the shape finally looked right, I slid under the boom, one arm jammed between the pulleys, flashlight wobbling in my teeth. Every motion felt heavier than it should have. I disconnected the clevis pin, threaded the wire into place, pushed until it locked. The fit was tight. I pulled the cable again, no slack. The aileron moved the instant I touched it. Smooth, sharp, alive. I tested it twice more to be sure. Perfect. I reattached the panel, wiped the blood from my hands and leaned against the fuselage. For a long minute I just stood there listening to the hum of the jungle outside, the frogs, the crickets, the far-off drone of a generator somewhere in the dark. I'd just broken every rule in the Army Air Force's manual, but for the first time that war, I felt hope heavier than fear. At 7:42 that morning, the engines roared to life. I stood on the edge of the flight line, hands black with grease, watching Hayes's P-38 taxi toward the runway. The rising sun turned the aluminum skin to gold. 17 planes followed in formation, but my eyes never left his. When he reached the end of the strip, he paused for just a second, long enough for me to see his hand lift in a small wave through the canopy. Then the throttles went forward. The twin props screamed, and the Lightning leapt into the sky. The sound hit me in the chest. I didn't breathe until he disappeared into the clouds. The airfield grew quiet again, except for the distant chatter of generators. I tried to go back to work, but my hands wouldn't steady. I kept glancing at the clock on the hangar wall, 7:58, 8:10, 8:20, each minute dragging like a year. Somewhere out there, Hayes was meeting the enemy. We started hearing radio traffic from the squadron. Static, call signs, short bursts of voices. Eagle lead, brake left. 20 high. Then silence. I recognized Hayes's call sign once. Eagle 3. But the transmission cut out mid-sentence. My stomach tightened. I knew that kind of silence. It was the sound before someone didn't come back. For 17 minutes, the airfield might as well have been the edge of the world. Every mechanic stopped pretending to work. We just listened to nothing. Then, faint at first, came the distant rumble of returning engines. I ran out to the line, heart hammering, scanning the horizon. One by one, the lightnings appeared, glinting in the sun. Then I saw Hayes's coming in low, smoke trailing from one boom but flying steady. The wheels touched down hard, bounced once, then settled. The plane rolled to a stop right in front of me. I could barely move. Hayes shut down the engines, popped the canopy, and climbed out. His flight suit was soaked through, face streaked with oil and sweat, eyes wide like he'd just seen God himself. He dropped to the ground, took a breath, and looked straight at me. For a second, neither of us said a word. Then he smiled, a small, stunned smile, and said 2 words I'll never forget. It worked. Word travelled fast in a place where nothing was supposed to. Captain Frank Mitchell saw it first. He'd been flying high cover that morning, and watched Hayes's fight from 15,000 feet. Later, he found me in the hangar still wiping grease off my hands. He didn't waste time with small talk. "You think you can do it to mine?" he asked. His tone wasn't curiosity, it was need. I told him what I told Hayes. It wasn't authorized, it wasn't safe for me, and if the brass found out, we'd both be in front of a court-martial. He just nodded. "Then let's keep it between us." That night I stayed late again, bent another piece of wire and did the same to Mitchell's P-38. The next morning he came back from patrol grinning like a man who'd found a secret. "Feels like flying a different airplane," he said. After that the whisper started to spread. Not through memos or orders, just through coffee cups and quiet hangars. One pilot told another, one crew chief told his buddy. Before long I was sneaking from hangar to hangar after midnight, teaching other mechanics how to bend the wire just right, how to hide it before inspection. 8 minutes of work that could save a life. No paperwork, no signatures, just trust and oil-stained hands. Some of us used scrap from wrecked planes, some cut their own from supply wire, whatever worked. We didn't talk about it during the day. The officers wouldn't have understood, but at night, under the hum of the lights, we shared a look that said everything. We were in this together. They started calling it McKenna's Fix, but I never liked that. It wasn't about pride, it was about survival. Every man who touched a lightning knew what it meant to lose a friend to a delay measured in heartbeats. We weren't trying to rewrite regulations or start a mutiny. We didn't call it rebellion. We called it keeping them alive. By the end of July, the numbers were grim. For every Japanese Zero shot down, 2 of our Lightnings were lost. We didn't need official reports to tell us. We could count the empty bunks ourselves. But by September, something started to shift. The ratio had evened out 1-to-1, and no one could explain why. Officially, nothing had changed. Same aircraft, same pilots, same tactics. But we knew. We heard it in the way the engines roared when they taxied out, the quick, confident roll on takeoff. Those planes felt alive again. The first time I noticed it, I was tightening a bolt on a wing mount when the radio crackled from the operations hut. The airman inside shouted out through the door, 3 zeros down, no losses. For a second the hangar went silent. Then someone laughed, a short, unbelieving sound, and the rest of us joined in. It wasn't loud or wild, just a low ripple of relief that spread through the line. We'd been surrounded by death for so long that the sound of victory almost felt strange. Hayes came back from that same mission with a grin that wouldn't quit. Oil smeared across his face like war paint. "She turns now," he said, patting the fuselage. I looked at him and felt something I hadn't in months. Pride. Not the kind they put in medals, but the kind that comes when you know you've done something right, even if no one will ever admit it. Word kept coming in. Mitchell got 3 kills in one day. Another pilot finally got his first after 8 weeks of nothing. The officers called it improved combat efficiency. We called it justice. In the maintenance bay, the mood began to change. There was still smoke, still the stench of oil and sweat, but for once there were smiles. We were still losing men, but fewer now, and for reasons that made sense. The Lightning was finally fighting back. I remember watching a flight take off one morning, the sun flashing off their wings, and thinking how fitting the name suddenly felt. For the first time, the Lightning lived up to its name. News of the change didn't just stay on our side of the Pacific. Word started filtering through intelligence channels, radio intercepts, captured reports, fragments of chatter from Japanese pilots. The rumour was spreading among the 11th Air Fleet. The Americans turned faster now. When I first heard it, I was sitting in the mess hall, halfway through a cup of burnt coffee, grease still on my hands. Someone read it off the bulletin board where the intelligence boys pinned translations. The whole room went quiet for a second, then somebody chuckled. Soon we were all laughing, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that comes from joy. It was disbelief, the absurd truth that the enemy was scared of a fix made from scrap wire and stubbornness. Turned faster now, I muttered to myself. If only they knew. Somewhere across that ocean, men were dying because of a 6-inch piece of piano wire hidden inside a boom. The thought hit me like a cold wind. For months we'd been on the losing end, watching friends vanish into jungle smoke. Now the Japanese were the ones asking questions, second-guessing their own tactics. Reports said even Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of their top aces, had been caught off guard when a P-38 rolled inside his turn. They called it impossible. I suppose it was, by the book. That was the strange part. Nothing about the aircraft looked different. No new weapons, no engine change, nothing visible at all. Just that little wire doing what engineering couldn't. I remember staring into my coffee, thinking how small the distance was between life and death in this war. A man could die because a cable lagged a heartbeat too long, or live because one mechanic didn't follow the rules. Around me, the laughter faded into silence again. We didn't talk about it much after that. We didn't need to. For once, the sky belonged to us, and the enemy was the one left wondering why. The secret spread faster than any order ever could. By early September, half the squadron was flying with the modification, but officially no one knew a thing. We learned to work like ghosts. Before every inspection, crew chiefs would crawl under the booms, pull out the little tensioners and tuck them into tool pouches. Once the officers signed off the checklists, we'd slip them back in, tighten the cables and wipe our fingerprints away. It became a rhythm: install, remove, reinstall, like a ritual shared only by those who understood. No paperwork, no chain of command, just a whisper chain and a handshake. You'd see it in the eyes of another mechanic across the hangar, a quick nod, and you knew he was one of us. We didn't talk about it openly. The officers were too tied to their manuals to ever understand. To them, rules kept the Air Force running. To us, those same rules were killing pilots. So we bent them, quietly, carefully, one airplane at a time. There was something almost sacred about those nights. The hangar lights would flicker, the air thick with oil and sweat, and we'd be crouched under the bellies of machines that roared to life each dawn. No medals, no fanfare, just the knowledge that a few turns of wire might decide whether a man lived to see another sunrise. Some of the younger crew called it rebellion. I told them it wasn't. We weren't heroes, and we weren't rebels. We were conspirators for survival. That phrase stuck. It fit the kind of men we were, ordinary, stubborn and unwilling to stand by while good people died for the sake of a regulation. Looking back, I think that's what war really does to a man. It strips away the speeches and orders until all that's left is the simple truth. You do what you have to so others get to go home. It couldn't stay secret forever. One morning in October, an inspector from Engineering Command came through for a surprise audit. He was a by-the-book man, the kind who measured bolts with calipers and quoted manuals like scripture. When he checked cable tension on one of the lightnings, the readings didn't add up. He frowned, ran the test again, and called for another aircraft. Same result. Too tight, far above the official tolerance. Within a day, the report was on a major's desk, and I knew the storm was coming. When they summoned me to the office, my hands were slick with sweat. I thought that was the end of me. Court-martial, dishonourable discharge, maybe worse. But instead of arresting me, they told me to wait. A week later, Lockheed sent a team of engineers all the way from California. They showed up in crisp uniforms, soft hands and puzzled faces, wondering why a mechanic in the jungle had broken their specs. They took one of the modified P-38s up for a test flight. We all stood on the flight line, watching them climb into the blue. 20 minutes later, they landed with smiles I hadn't seen on an engineer before. The lead man pulled me aside. "You did this?" he asked. I nodded, ready for the hammer to fall. Instead, he grinned and said, "Hell, Sergeant, this should have been part of the design all along." That sentence hit harder than any medal ever could. They spent a week running tests, checking stress loads, measuring every inch of the cable. Their final report said the modification was safe, effective, and improved roll response by 13%. The command approved the change for the new P-38J model, but my name never appeared anywhere in the paperwork. Officially, it was an engineering refinement. I went back to turning wrenches like before, same grease, same hanger, pretending nothing had happened. The brass got their improved lightning, the pilots got a fighting chance. And I got silence, a quiet kind of victory that no one would ever salute. When the war finally ended, the jungle quiet felt strange. No engines, no radio chatter, no thunder in the sky. Just wind and the sound of men packing up what was left of their youth. Hayes made it home to Iowa. He married his high school sweetheart, built a little farm and raised 4 kids. Every year on August 17th, he called me without fail. "Just wanted to say thanks, Sarge," he'd tell me. Same words, same voice, year after year. He never mentioned the wire, and neither did I. We didn't have to. Mitchell stayed in the service, climbed the ranks, and by career he was a colonel. He used to tell new maintenance officers the story, not with my name, but with the lesson. Sometimes, he'd say, the best ideas don't come from the top. I liked that. It meant he understood. As for me, I came home to California in '46. The war was over, but my hands still reached for tools every morning like the fight hadn't ended. I opened a little garage in Long Beach, fixing Buicks and Fords for people who never knew how close I'd once worked to death. When folks asked what I'd done in the war, I'd shrug and say, fixed airplanes. That was enough. I didn't need stories or medals. The men who came back were the only proof I ever wanted. Sometimes late at night I'd hear an engine rev outside and catch myself listening for the pitch of the old P-38s. The way the twin props used to hum in perfect sync before takeoff. It would pull me right back to that hangar, the sweat, the smell, the hum of hope hiding under fear. The world moved on, new wars, new machines, new names, but the wire stayed in my memory. Not the metal itself, but what it meant. That one small act, done quietly, could ripple farther than anyone imagined. In 1991, I was 73 and still working part-time in my garage when a young military historian showed up. He'd found my name in an old maintenance log from New Guinea and wanted to ask about something called the piano wire modification. I laughed when he said it. Nobody had spoken those words to me in almost 50 years. We sat in the office behind the shop, the smell of motor oil and old coffee between us. He turned on his recorder and asked if I'd really changed the flight controls of a combat aircraft without permission. I told him the truth. It wasn't genius, I said. It was necessity. He wrote that down like it was something profound, but to me it was simple. When you've seen enough young men die, you stop caring about manuals and start caring about minutes, because sometimes minutes are all they have. He stayed for an hour, asked his questions, thanked me and left. I never thought much about it after that. 15 years later, in 2006, my hands finally quit turning wrenches. The world had changed a dozen times over. New wars, new faces, new machines. But people still came to the shop, and the old photograph still hung on the back wall. It was black and white, edges yellowed with age. A young man in oil-stained coveralls standing beside a P-38 Lightning, the date scrawled on the back, August 1943, New Guinea. When I passed, they buried me at Pacific View Memorial Park in California. The stone marker said only, James McKenna, WW2 aircraft mechanic. No mention of the wire, no story of what it did, and that's all right. The men who lived were the only tribute I ever needed. Sometimes when I think back, I wonder how many lives that 6-inch piece of wire really saved. I'll never know, and maybe that's better. What matters isn't how many. It's that, for once, a mechanic's hands made a difference. Because in war, saving lives isn't about medals or manuals. It's about knowing when the rules get in the way of doing what's right.